The rejection happened so often Margaret stopped opening the paperwork immediately. By the third year, she already knew what it said. Still, she unfolded the page slowly beside the grain scale office while cold October wind pushed dust across the lot. Load not accepted. Out of specification parameters. Same words. Different year. Margaret stared at them a while, then folded the paper again. Behind the scale window, Dale Harper leaned against the counter with the uncomfortable expression people wear when delivering bad news they didn't create. Margaret. She looked up. Yes. Dale rubbed the back of his neck. They ran it twice. Silence. Margaret looked at the paper, then back at him. You want me to explain? No. Long pause. No. She climbed into the truck. You explained last year. That answer somehow made Dale feel worse. Because he remembered last year. And the year before. Free harvests. Free rejections. 3 years of hauling grain into town only to bring it back home again. The frustrating part wasn't that the grain looked bad. Because it didn't. The kernels looked rich and healthy. Deep reddish gold instead of bright yellow. Smaller. Denser. Different. Different turned out to be the problem. The Hale farm sat on 180 acres outside Lexington, Kentucky, where Margaret inherited land after her father died in 1989. Corn country surrounded her. Every direction. Endless rows of yellow grain rolling over hills beneath summer skies. Everybody grew roughly the same thing. Hybrid varieties. High yield. Standard characteristics. Standard buyers. Standard expectations. Margaret broke that system accidentally. It started 5 years earlier during a county historical fair. One old agricultural display sat near the back corner, mostly ignored by visitors. Glass jars filled with forgotten corn varieties. Red corn, blue corn, white dent corn, names nobody used anymore. Margaret stopped because of one jar. Dark copper-red kernels, almost glowing beneath sunlight. An elderly historian noticed her staring. Beautiful, isn't it? Margaret nodded. What happened to it? The old man shrugged. Yield happened. She frowned. Yield. He smiled sadly. Modern farming rewards bushels. He tapped the glass. Not personality. That sentence stayed with her. Mostly because wheat prices and grain prices already squeezed smaller farms harder every year. Competing through volume felt impossible. She kept thinking, what if everybody chasing the same thing was the problem? So she started reading, researching, calling universities, agricultural archives, old seed preservation groups. Then finally, she found seed stock from a preserved heirloom red corn line once grown across sections of Kentucky nearly 70 years earlier. Nobody around her understood why she cared. Dale definitely didn't. What exactly are you growing? He asked one spring while watching Margaret load seed bags. Corn. Dale stared. No. Yes. No. He pointed toward the bags. Normal people corn. Margaret smiled faintly. This is normal somewhere. That answer irritated him immediately. Because Margaret answered strange questions like she was discussing weather. Simple. Calm. Never defensive. The first year looked promising. Plants grew beautifully. Strong stalks. Healthy ears. Good weather. Margaret actually felt excited during harvest. Then she hauled the grain into town. And everything stopped. The elevator manager studied the sample tray silently. Then frowned. Then called another employee over. Then another. Margaret hated that immediately. Because nobody calls extra people for good reasons. Grant Mercer looked over the kernels carefully. What variety is this? Margaret folded her arms. Red heirloom dent. Silence. Long silence. Grant finally sighed. Margaret. That was how bad news always started. Margaret. What? Grant slid paperwork across the counter. This doesn't fit standard grading channels. She stared. What? Protein levels are unusual. Kernel size inconsistent. Density characteristics different. Margaret blinked slowly. It's still corn. Grant looked uncomfortable. Yes. Then buy it. Long pause. We don't have markets for this. She laughed once. Not because it felt funny. Because it felt ridiculous. You don't have markets. She pointed toward the grain. For corn. The second year hurt worse. Because the first rejection could have been bad luck. The second started feeling like reality. People joked more openly after that. At the co-op, Dale announced dramatically. Good news, everybody. Rick looked up. What? Margaret invented decorative grain. Laughter spread immediately. Margaret kept drinking coffee. Mostly ignoring them. Mostly. But late at night doubt arrived. Because doubt always arrives at kitchen tables. Especially beside bills. One evening, her daughter Emily sat across from her while Margaret stared through the window toward grain bins. "You okay?" Margaret looked over. "No." Emily frowned. "The grain thing?" Margaret nodded slowly. "Free harvests. Free years of stored grain. Free years of partial feed sales barely covering expenses. Free years wondering whether she'd made the dumbest decision of her life." Emily looked toward the bins outside. "Can I ask something?" Margaret looked up. "What? Why keep planting it?" Silence. Long silence. Margaret stared toward the darkness outside. Then finally, "Because every year I almost quit." Emily waited. "And?" Margaret looked back. "And every year I walk through those fields and think." She smiled faintly. "There has to be somebody who wants this." That spring she planted again. Year 4. People thought she'd officially lost her mind. Even Dale looked concerned now. "You know, stubborn and smart aren't the same thing." Margaret loaded fertilizer bags into the truck. "Yes. You also know 3 years is usually enough evidence." Margaret closed the tailgate. "Evidence of what?" Dale spread his arms. "That nobody wants it." Margaret looked toward distant fields, then smiled slightly. "Were evidence I'm asking the wrong people." Dale stared. Because deep down, he hated how that almost sounded reasonable. Harvest came again. Beautiful crop. Rich color. Strong yield. And once again, the elevator rejected everything. That evening Margaret stood alone beside grain bins beneath orange sunset light. Wind moved quietly across harvested fields. For harvest now. 4. She looked at the bins. Looked at the sky. Then laughed softly to herself. Because maybe Dale was right. Maybe stubborn and smart really weren't the same thing. Then headlights appeared at the end of the dirt lane. Strange headlights. Not local. A black pickup truck rolled slowly toward the farm pulling a trailer. Kentucky plates. Dust covering the sides. The truck stopped near the barn. A man climbed out wearing work boots and a heavy jacket. He looked exhausted. Like he'd been driving a long time. He smiled politely. "My name's Henry Lawson." Margaret frowned. "Hello." The man looked past her toward the grain bins. Then asked, "Are you the woman growing the red corn?" Margaret stared at the man for several seconds. Because after 4 harvests of rejection, random men appearing beside grain bins felt suspicious. "I'm Margaret." The man nodded and extended his hand. "Henry Lawson." She shook it slowly, then looked toward the truck. Dust covered nearly every inch of it. Dead bugs coated the grill. Road grime stretched across the trailer. This wasn't local driving. Not even close. "You drove a long way," she said. Henry looked back toward the road. "About 400 miles. Silence. Margaret blinked. 400. Henry nodded. "Yes." Long pause. "For corn." Henry smiled. "No." He pointed toward the grain bins. "For that corn." Behind the house, Emily stepped out onto the porch and immediately noticed the strange truck. Then noticed Margaret's expression. Then walked over. "Everything okay?" Margaret looked at her. "I don't know yet." Henry laughed softly. "Fair." The next morning, he walked through the grain bins with a notebook in his hand. Not like an elevator buyer. Not like somebody checking moisture levels and weights. More like someone studying art. He picked up handfuls of kernels. Held them beneath sunlight. Rubbed them between his fingers. Even smelled them. Dale Harper nearly drove off the road seeing it. He pulled into the yard immediately. Of course he did. Small towns run entirely on curiosity. He climbed out and stared at Henry. "Who are you?" Henry looked up. "Henry Lawson." Dale folded his arms. "And bourbon." Silence. Then, "Bourbon." Henry nodded. "Yes." Dale looked toward Margaret. Then toward the grain bins. Then back again. "No." Margaret shrugged. "Apparently yes." Inside the barn, Henry spread kernels across an old workbench. Margaret watched while Emily poured coffee. Finally, Margaret asked, "You own a distillery?" Henry nodded. "Lawson Ridge." He pointed toward the corn. "We've been looking for this." Margaret frowned. "This?" Henry smiled. "Heirloom red dent." Silence. Margaret stared. "You know what this is?" Henry looked genuinely surprised. "Yes." He picked up several kernels. "Most bourbon today uses highly standardized grain." Then he held up her corn. "But older varieties create different flavor profiles." Emily frowned. "Flavor?" Henry looked at her. "Everything starts with grain." He rolled the kernels through his palm. "Different starch. Different sugars. Different oils. Different character." Margaret stared quietly. Because 4 years of rejection suddenly felt very strange. Every elevator talked about problems. Protein variation. Density. Kernel size. Nobody once talked about character. Henry smiled. You know what your problem is? Margaret laughed softly. Apparently, everyone knows. Henry shook his head. No. He pointed toward the bins. You've been selling ingredients to commodity buyers. Silence. Then, that's like taking racehorses to a mule auction. Emily actually laughed out loud. Margaret just stared. Because suddenly something clicked. The grain wasn't wrong. The place was. For 4 years, she'd walked through the wrong door. Henry spent 2 days taking samples and asking questions. Soil types, rainfall, harvest conditions, storage practices, everything. By the third afternoon, Margaret finally asked, "So, how much are you looking for?" Henry looked up. "How much do you have?" Margaret blinked. "All of it." Henry nodded. "Yes." Silence. Absolute silence. Wind moved softly outside the barn. Margaret looked at Emily. Emily looked back. Then Margaret looked at Henry. "All of it." Henry smiled. "If quality stays consistent." Margaret folded her arms slowly. "What's the price?" Henry named the number. Emily dropped the pencil she was holding. Margaret honestly thought she'd heard wrong. Because the offer sat far above standard grain pricing. Not a little higher. Wildly higher. Enough to erase debt. Enough to repair machinery. Enough to breathe again. Enough to matter. Henry saw her expression. "That shocked you?" Margaret nodded slowly. "A little." Henry leaned back. "Elevators buy grain." He pointed toward the bins. "We buy identity." 3 weeks later, black transport trailers rolled onto the Hale farm. People noticed immediately. Of course they did. Because unfamiliar trucks arriving repeatedly at a farm everyone joked about for years wasn't exactly subtle. Dale nearly drove into a fence seeing the first shipment loading. He pulled into the yard before Margaret finished paperwork. "What the hell is happening?" Margaret signed another receipt calmly. "Selling corn." Dale pointed wildly toward the trailers. "Who drives 400 miles for corn?" Margaret looked toward Henry, standing beside the bins. "Bourbon people." That sentence spread through Lexington faster than weather reports. Nobody believed it at first. Then more trucks arrived. Then more. Then more. The same people who once laughed at Margaret's weird corn suddenly started asking cautious questions. What variety was it? You keeping seed? How do you find buyers? Rick Harlow arrived one afternoon pretending he wasn't curious. "I don't want to grow it." Margaret smiled. "Okay. I'm just asking." "Okay. You enjoying this?" "Yes. Very much." By the second season, Henry returned before planting. Then before harvest. Then every year afterward. Not because he needed to. Because he wanted to. He walked fields personally. Checked ears by hand. Talked about weather and grain like people talk about family. One evening during harvest, Dale stood beside Margaret watching grain pour into waiting trailers beneath orange sunset light. "You know what still bothers me?" he asked. Margaret smiled faintly. "What?" Dale stared toward the corn. "I held this stuff." Margaret looked over. "At the elevator." He shook his head slowly. "I remember laughing." Wind moved softly through harvested fields. Long shadows stretched across the farm. For years the grain elevator looked at Margaret Hale's crop and saw problems. Too different. Too unusual. Too hard to fit inside standard boxes. Then one bourbon maker drove 400 miles and saw something nobody else recognized. Not grain. Not defects. Not risk. Character. And after that, he came back every harvest.